The Vietnam War lasted 10 years, cost America 58,000 lives, and over $1 trillion adjusted for inflation. It brought down a president, stirred social unrest, and ended in defeat. No one in hindsight believes fighting a losing war is ever worth the cost. Consequently, the Vietnam War is usually written off as a colossal strategic blunder and a humanitarian disaster.
Vietnam was part of French Indochina, a French colony in Southeast Asia established in 1887 for the French to reinforce Catholic missionaries. Indochina was controlled by France up until World War II, when France was invaded by Nazi Germany and Japan invaded Indochina. The Japanese ruled through the former French protectorate emperor Bao Dai as a puppet. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh, a communist army who rose up against the Japanese occupiers. After the Japanese defeat in 1945, the Viet Minh declared Vietnamese independence with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and Hanoi as its capital, and extended their war against the French, becoming the First Indochina War. During this time, the Cold War was setting in, and the USA were backing anti-communist regimes, while the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China were backing pro-communist regimes. The Korean War was a fine example of this. Thusly, China and the Soviet Union backed the Viet Minh, and the USA and Britain backed the French in the South. The state of Vietnam was established with Emperor Bao Dai as the leader in an anti-communist regime. American military advisors had been helping the French, though President Eisenhower was reluctant to put US troops on the ground. The Viet Minh ultimately were victorious, and it was decided in the Geneva Accords that Vietnam be divided into the State of Vietnam and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Cambodia and Laos were also granted independence, ending French Indochina. Ngo Dinh Diem became the Prime Minister in the South. As South Vietnam prepared for a referendum on reuniting North and South, many northern Vietnamese Catholics fled south, while many Viet Minh went north to plan ahead. The North Vietnam regime sought to take power away from the landlords and distribute the wealth among the peasants. Many people were executed and wrongly imprisoned. The referendum was held, but many were skeptical about its fairness. Diem rigged the votes, winning a ridiculously massive majority in keeping the South separate. Diem declared the South independent and became the Republic of Vietnam, with Saigon as its capital. Thus, Vietnam would move into the Second Indochina War, or simply known in the West as the Vietnam War. The US looked on in fear, believing that communism would spread like dominoes, and if Vietnam fell, it would threaten India, Japan, and other nations in that region. Diem set about quelling any communist actions in the South, arresting and executing many people. He was a Roman Catholic, which was often at odds with the predominantly Buddhist population. In 1960, communist forces and other anti-government groups in the South were organized into the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, as they were branded by the South. North Vietnam support came via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a border-hopping trail connecting North and South via Laos and Cambodia. Support for the NLF was strongest in the countryside, which was being crushed by extreme rent and landlord reforms by the South government. The government, under US advisement and funding, tried to relocate many rural peasants into strategic hamlets to keep them away from the influence of the NLF insurgents, but the program was a failure and actually ended up strengthening the NLF. New US President John F. Kennedy faced many embarrassments with the spread of communism, such as the Bay of Pigs disaster, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the growth of communist power in Laos. He believed Vietnam was where he could make a strong stand against the spread of communism. Kennedy was reluctant to put US troops on the ground, believing that the South Vietnam Army had to defeat the NLF on their own, but they were disorganized, crippled by political corruption, and under constant attack from guerrilla forces. More and more US military advisors and equipment were sent to Vietnam to help, but despite this, the South Vietnam Army continued to suffer silly defeats at the hands of the NLF. By 1963, religious tensions ran high as the pro-Catholic government discriminated more and more against Buddhists, banning their flag, killing protesters, and raiding pagodas. Protests intensified. On November 1st, officers of the South Vietnam Army rose up against the government and captured the leaders in a coup d'etat. Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother and advisor Ngo Dinh Nho were brutally assassinated the following day. The NLF took advantage of the political chaos of the South and strengthened their position with the people. To add even more instability, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, less than a month after the coup. Lyndon B. Johnson became the new US president, and things changed. After some more coups, General Nguyen Can became head of the South Vietnamese Military Council. The CIA had been training South Vietnamese forces and sending Vietnamese commandos on raids in the north. On August 2nd, 1964, the U.S. Navy ship, the USS Maddox, was monitoring signals coming from North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. It fired 3 warning shots at some North Vietnam torpedo boats, who opened fire with torpedoes and machine guns. The skirmish resulted in 4 Vietnamese casualties and no U.S. casualties. 2 days later, a similar incident was reported from the Maddox, but it would later turn out to be false. But not before these incidents were used by President Johnson to order an airstrike and get Congress to push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allowed him to escalate the United States' involvement in Vietnam without an actual declaration of war. Johnson ensured the US people that he would not be sending American boys over to Vietnam. Before he was re-elected, conscription in the United States, known as the draft, had been on the go constantly since 1940 to fill gaps in the army where volunteers weren't joining. As tensions in Vietnam escalated, many young men tried to avoid the draft, which could be a criminal offense.
While 2/3 of Americans volunteered during the Vietnam War, the other third would be drafted. All males aged 18 to 26 were required to register for the draft. The names of American men of draft age were recorded by the Selective Service System. When called out by the local draft board, which was often composed of veterans, he would be evaluated on whether he would be drafted in the military or not. The local board's decisions were often seen as unfair. Most of the men chosen were from poor and working class backgrounds, people of color, and people from rural towns and farming communities. Draft boards would frequently defer middle-class men, who they would see as having valuable futures, and the upper classes were barely drafted at all. There were many ways in which draftees could be deferred or exempt from the draft. For example, men who were medically unfit, men who were married with children, or students at college.
I want you so bad. I want you. I want you so bad. It's driving me mad. It's driving me mad. I want you so bad. I want you so bad. It's driving me mad. It's driving me mad. She's so
tests. The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial military engagements in United States history. It was an unpopular war at the time due to several factors. First and foremost, the United States had not clearly articulated its objectives in Vietnam. Secondly, there was no clear declaration of war. Media coverage of the Vietnam War also turned public opinion at home. The daily body counts provided by news anchors on the three major networks alerted Americans to the fact that the Vietnam conflict might very well be unwinnable. Anti-Vietnam War protests actually began as a relatively small movement among intellectuals in small circles on college campuses prior to 1965. It wasn't until the war escalated in 1965 that the widespread anti-Vietnam War protests that most Americans are familiar with became prominent. The largest and most famous of the anti-Vietnam War protests took place in October of 1967, when more than 100,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to protest the war in Vietnam.
You know what? The real heroes are the men that died. 19, 20-year-old high school dropouts. They didn't have escape routes that the elite and the wealthy and the privileged had. And that was unfair. And so they looked upon military services like the weather. You had to go in and you do it. But to see these kids who had the least to gain, there wasn't anything to look forward to. They were going to be rewarded for their service in Vietnam. And yet, their infinite patience, their loyalty to each other, their courage under fire was just phenomenal.
Well, the entire time we were there, we described it as hours and hours and hours of boredom. I mean, discomfort and boredom, interrupted occasionally by just shocking moments of terror. And there is just nothing that you can describe about all of a sudden hearing gunfire coming from a place you can't see, and hearing bullets and knowing that they were meant for you. So no matter how you describe it, you clutch up and you get down, and we would burrow and we would do everything we could to find cover and fight back. But honestly, it's scary. I mean, I don't have a good formula for how you do that, because so much of it was just luck of the draw. You were either in the range of fire or you weren't. And the first couple of times it happened, I was less in the range of fire than I was later. But at the same time, it plays the same for everybody, and for how it works on your emotions. And it's frightening stuff. Honestly, there was nothing to win. We'd already lost our country. We'd already lost our support from home. We wanted to stay alive.